The security camera footage was crystal clear. Margaret Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, climbing over Sarah Chen's fence at 2:47 a.m. What she didn't know was that Sarah had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. As Margaret's manicured fingers dialed 911 to report a dangerous pool violation, Sarah smiled, knowing the woman who'd made her life hell was about to discover that some pools run deeper than others, and this one was about to swallow her whole. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cool glass of her kitchen window, watching Margaret Whitmore march across the pristine lawns of Willowbrook Estates like a general survey in conquered territory. At 62, Margaret moved with the calculated precision of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making other people's lives miserable. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval, and her clipboard, that damned clipboard, was clutched against her chest like a shield. "She's coming this way again," Sarah muttered, her breath fogging the window. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms. 3 years of this woman's relentless campaign to drive her out of the neighborhood. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the morning silence like a blade. Sarah counted to 10 before opening the door, forcing her expression into neutral territory. Margaret stood on the pristine welcome mat, her pale blue eyes scanning Sarah's appearance with undisguised contempt. Behind her, 2 other HOA board members flanked her like backup singers: Janet Morrison, a woman whose hobby seemed to be collecting grievances, and Bob Fletcher, whose main qualification for the board appeared to be his ability to nod enthusiastically at Margaret's every word. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret began, her voice carrying the false sweetness of artificial vanilla, "we need to discuss your pool situation." Again, Sarah's jaw tightened. "My pool situation? The fence height violation we've discussed multiple times. The landscaping that doesn't conform to community standards? Margaret's eyes narrowed as she consulted her clipboard. "Unauthorized pool lighting that creates a nuisance for your neighbors. The fence meets all city codes," Sarah replied, her voice steady, despite the anger building in her chest. "The landscaping was approved by the architectural committee last spring, and the pool lights are the same ones installed by the previous homeowner who was on your precious board." Margaret's smile sharpened. "Community standards evolve, Mrs. Chen. What was acceptable then may not be acceptable now. I'm sure you, being new to American homeownership customs, can appreciate the importance of maintaining our property values." The casual racism hit Sarah like a slap. She'd been born in Sacramento, had a PhD in environmental engineering, and had saved for 8 years to buy this house. But to Margaret, she'd always be an outsider who didn't belong in their exclusive enclave. "I'm not new to anything," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "and I'm not going anywhere." Janet stepped forward, her thin face pinched with excitement. "Mrs. Chen, we're trying to help you avoid unpleasantness. The community has standards that seem to apply selectively." Sarah cut her off. "Funny how the Hendersons' fence is 2 inches higher than mine, but I don't see any violation notices in their mailbox. Strange how the Patel's garden lighting is twice as bright as mine, but somehow that's not a nuisance." Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "I think we're done here. You have 30 days to address these violations, or we'll be forced to take further action." "What kind of action?" The older woman's smile returned, predatory and patient. "The kind that protects our community from problematic residents." After they left, Sarah stood in her doorway, watching them retreat down the tree-lined streets. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from pure rage. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd hoped she'd never have to use. "David, it's Sarah Chen. I think it's time we talked about that security system upgrade." David Park had been her college roommate's cousin, and now ran a high-end security installation company. More importantly, he understood exactly what it meant to be the target of people like Margaret Whitmore. 2 hours later, David was crouched by her pool deck, running cables for cameras so small they looked like decorative stones. "You sure about this level of coverage?" he asked, gesturing to the array of devices. "This is like Fort Knox-level surveillance." Sarah nodded grimly. "Margaret Whitmore has been trying to drive me out since the day I moved in. She's escalated every time I've stood my ground. I have a feeling she's not done yet." "What makes you think she'll actually trespass?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of Margaret's car parked across the street at 11 p.m. the previous Tuesday, the woman herself barely visible in the shadows near Sarah's fence line. "She's been watching, testing. I've seen her 3 times this month. Always late at night, always just close enough to the property line to avoid legal issues." David whistled low. "Okay, yeah, you need the full package. Motion sensors, infrared, capability, cloud backup, the works. If she tries anything, we'll have it all." They worked until sunset, installing a web of nearly invisible security measures throughout her backyard. The pool area, the fence line, the gate, everything would be monitored and recorded. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the new security system's soft blue glow visible through her bedroom window. Her phone was on the nightstand, the monitoring app already downloaded and configured. Part of her hoped Margaret would just back down, find some other target for her toxic attention. But a larger part, the part that had spent 3 years swallowing insults and fake smiles and casual racism, hoped Margaret would push too far. Because Sarah Chen wasn't the helpless victim Margaret thought she was. She was an engineer who solved problems methodically, thoroughly, and permanently. At 2:47 a.m., her phone buzzed with a motion alert. Sarah rolled over and opened the app, expecting to see a raccoon or neighbor's cat triggering the sensors. Instead, she saw Margaret Whitmore's face, illuminated by infrared light, as the woman carefully climbed over the 6-foot privacy fence into Sarah's backyard. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Margaret land gracefully on the other side, then pull out her own phone and begin taking pictures of the pool area. The older woman moved with practiced efficiency, photographing the fence from multiple angles, the pool lights, the landscaping building, what looked like evidence for some kind of case. For 15 minutes, Margaret documented everything with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. Then she did something that made Sarah's blood freeze. She pulled a small bag from her pocket and began scattering what looked like trash around the pool deck: beer bottles, cigarette butts, food, wrappers. Margaret was manufacturing evidence. Sarah grabbed her laptop and began downloading the security footage to multiple cloud accounts, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Whatever Margaret was planning, Sarah would be ready. At 3:15 a.m., Margaret climbed back over the fence and disappeared into the night. At 6:30 a.m., Sarah's doorbell rang. She opened it to find 2 police officers standing on her doorstep, their expressions professional but wary. "Ma'am, we've received a report about a public health violation at this address," the taller officer said, something about unsanitary conditions around a swimming pool that might be attracting rodents and creating a neighborhood hazard. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Officers, I think you're going to find this very interesting. Would you like to see what really happened here last night?" The trap had been set for 3 years. Margaret Whitmore had finally walked into it, and Sarah Chen was about to spring it closed. Officer Martinez, the taller of the 2 policemen, exchanged a glance with his partner as Sarah stepped aside to let them into her immaculate living room. The house was spotless, professionally decorated, and smelled faintly of vanilla candles, the dwelling of someone creating public health hazards. "Ma'am, the complaint was filed by ... Officer Martinez consulted his notepad. "Margaret Whitmore, who serves as the HOA president. She reported unsanitary conditions, possible health code violations, and what she described as evidence of drug and alcohol activity around your pool area." Sarah's eyebrows rose. Drug and alcohol activity, that's single quotes S ... creative. "Officers, would you mind if I showed you something before we go outside?" She led them to her home office, where her laptop was still open, the security footage queued and ready. "I installed a comprehensive security system yesterday. Last night, it captured something rather interesting." Officer Rodriguez, the shorter partner, leaned forward as Sarah clicked play. Both officers watched in stunned silence as the infrared footage showed Margaret Whitmore scaling the fence, methodically photographing the pool area, then deliberately scattering trash and empty bottles around the deck. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, ma'am, but this is... she's literally planting evidence." "The timestamp shows 2:47 a.m., Sarah said, her voice calm and professional. "I have multiple camera angles, and everything is automatically backed up to cloud storage. As you can see, my pool area was completely clean before Mrs. Whitmore's visit." Martinez was already reaching for his radio. "We need to document this scene before anyone disturbs it further. Rodriguez, start taking photos of everything outside. I'll call for a supervisor." 20 minutes later, Sarah's backyard had transformed into a crime scene. 3 patrol cars were parked in her driveway, and Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes, was reviewing the security footage for the 3rd time. "Mrs. Chen, this is one of the clearest cases of evidence tampering I've ever seen," Williams said, shaking his head. "The question is whether you want to press charges. What are my options? Criminal trespass, vandalism, filing a false police report, potentially criminal mischief. With this footage, we could make several charges stick." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. "I want to press all possible charges. But first, I think Mrs. Whitmore deserves a chance to explain herself, don't you?" Williams grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Margaret Whitmore's house sat at the end of Maple Lane like a monument to suburban perfection. The lawn was so precisely manicured it looked artificial, the hedges trimmed with mathematical precision, and the American flag hung from a pole positioned at exactly the regulation angle. Even her doormat was centered to the millimeter. Margaret answered the door wearing a silk robe and an expression of carefully practiced surprise. "Officers, how can I help you?" "Mrs. Whitmore, we're here about the complaint you filed regarding your neighbor's property," Sergeant Williams said. "We've completed our investigation." Margaret's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. "Oh, wonderful. I knew you'd find violations. That woman has been a menace to this neighborhood since the day she moved in. I've documented everything: the noise, the inappropriate landscaping, the complete disregard for our community standards. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to view the evidence, Martinez said. Of course, I have photographs, detailed notes, witness statements from concerned neighbors. I've been building a case against her for months. As they walked back toward Sarah's house, Margaret chattered excitedly about property values and community standards. Clearly believing she was finally about to see her nemesis removed from the neighborhood, Sarah watched from her kitchen window. As the group approached, Margaret's voice carrying across the quiet morning air. You'll see that I was absolutely right to call this in, Margaret was saying. The health department should be involved too. I've seen rats in the area, and I'm certain it's because of the unsanitary conditions she's been maintaining. Reached Sarah's backyard, where the planted evidence was still scattered exactly where Margaret had left it. Williams gestured toward the pool deck. Mrs. Whitmore, can you show us exactly what you observed? Margaret's performance was Oscar-worthy. She gasped dramatically, pointing at the beer bottles and cigarette butts with trembling fingers. It's even worse than when I called it in. Look at this mess. This is exactly what I was talking about. Disregard for our community? When did you first notice these conditions? Rodriguez asked, his pen poised over his notepad. I've been monitoring the situation for weeks, Margaret said, her voice rising with righteous indignation. I document everything. Officers, I have photos from multiple visits showing the progressive deterioration of this property. Sarah stepped out onto her back patio, her laptop in her hands. Mrs. Whitmore, that's interesting, because according to my security system, this is the first time any debris has appeared in my backyard. Margaret's face went pale, but she quickly rallied. Your security system, how dare you spy on your neighbors? This is harassment. Pure and simple. Actually, Sergeant Williams said, stepping forward. Mrs. Chen's security cameras are pointed at her own property, which is perfectly legal. However, what they captured last night is very interesting. Sarah turned her laptop screen toward Margaret and clicked play. The color drained from Margaret's face as she watched herself climbing over the fence, moving stealthily through the backyard, planting the evidence she was now claiming to have discovered. That's not. There must be some mistake, Margaret stammered, but her voice had lost all its authority. The timestamp is clearly visible, Sarah said quietly. 2:47 a.m. Would you like to explain why you were trespassing on my property in the middle of the night, Mrs. Whitmore? Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and everyone could see it happening in real time. Mrs. Whitmore, Sergeant Williams said, his voice official now. You're under arrest for criminal trespass, vandalism, and filing a false police report. This is ridiculous, Margaret shrieked, her composure finally shattering completely. You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. I was protecting this neighborhood from from people like her. The racist subtext hung in the air like toxic smoke. Officer Martinez stepped forward with handcuffs, his jaw tight with disgust. Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. I'd strongly suggest you use it. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, her voice echoing across the pristine lawns of Willowbrook Estates, neighbors began emerging from their houses. Janet Morrison stood frozen on her front porch, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Bob Fletcher was peeking through his blinds, his face pale with panic. Sarah stood in her backyard, watching the police cars drive away with their cargo of fallen HOA royalty. Her phone was already buzzing with calls and texts from neighbors who'd witnessed the arrest. But the real surprise came an hour later, when David Park called. Sarah, you need to check your email, like right now. What's wrong? Remember how I told you the security system would automatically upload everything to the cloud? Well, it also has facial recognition software that scans for known individuals. Margaret Whitmore has been in your backyard before. A lot. Sarah's blood ran cold. What do you mean? I mean your system has been cataloging her visits for the past week since installation. She's been there 7 times. Sarah, always between 2 and 4 a.m. Always photographing, always documenting. Last night wasn't her first rodeo, it was just the first time she planted evidence. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, the full scope of Margaret's obsession becoming clear. This hadn't been a spur-of-a-moment decision to frame her. This had been a calculated campaign of surveillance and harassment, building to last night's attempt to have her arrested on false charges. David, I need you to compile everything. Every visit, every timestamp, every angle. If Margaret Whitmore wants to play games with my life, she's about to learn that some games have consequences she never imagined. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Margaret's arrest was just the beginning. The real reckoning was about to begin. It would reach far beyond one racist HOA president's fall from grace. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for 7 p.m. that same evening, barely 12 hours after Margaret's arrest had sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Estates. Sarah arrived at the community center to find the parking lot packed with cars and the building buzzing with nervous energy. News traveled fast in their insular neighborhood, and Margaret's perp walk had been witnessed by half the residents. Janet Morrison stood at the entrance, her face drawn, and her usual smugness replaced by barely controlled panic. When she saw Sarah approaching, her eyes widened like she'd seen a ghost. "Sarah, we need to talk," Janet stammered, blocking the doorway. "Before you go in there, what happened this morning? It was all Margaret's idea. Bob and I had no idea she was moved," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a steel edge that made Janet step aside immediately. The community center's main room was packed beyond capacity. Sarah recognized faces from 3 years of HOA meetings, some curious, some hostile, many wearing expressions of dawning horror as they began to understand the implications of their president's actions. She took a seat in the front row, directly facing the board table where Bob Fletcher sat alone. Sweating profusely despite the air conditioning, Bob cleared his throat nervously. Given recent developments, I'm calling this emergency meeting to address the situation regarding our former president Margaret Whitmore." Former called out Tom Patterson from the back of the room. "Since when?" "Since she was arrested this morning for criminal trespass and filing false police reports," Bob replied, his voice cracking. "The board has voted to remove her from office effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the security app, where David had compiled all the footage from the past week. 7 visits. 7 times Margaret had violated Sarah's privacy, photographed her property, and planned her destruction. "I have something the board needs to see," Sarah announced, standing up. Bob's face went ashen. "Sarah, maybe we should handle this privately?" "No." Sarah's voice cut through the room like a blade. "This community deserves to know exactly what kind of person they elected to represent them." She connected her phone to the room's projection system, and the first video began playing on the wall-mounted screen. The timestamp read Monday, 2:23 a.m. Margaret Whitmore, captured in infrared, climbing over Sarah's fence and methodically photographing her pool area. The room fell dead silent. "This was 1 week ago," Sarah said, her voice steady and clinical. "Tuesday night, 2:45 a.m. Another video, Margaret again, this time measuring distances with a tape measure. Wednesday, 3:10 a.m. Margaret photographing the fence from multiple angles. Thursday, she brought a ladder to get better shots of my landscaping. With each timestamp, the crowd's horror deepened. Some residents had their hands pressed to their mouths. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd always been kind to Sarah, was openly weeping. "Times in 1 week," Sarah continued. 7 felony trespassing incidents. All documented, all saved to cloud storage, all time-stamped with GPS coordinates. But here's what makes it truly disturbing. She pulled up a different folder on her phone. "These are the violation notices I've received over the past 3 years. 47 separate complaints, all filed by Margaret Whitmore. Pool fence height measured incorrectly 6 different times. Landscaping violations for plants that were on the approved species list. Noise complaints for pool parties that ended before 8 p.m. Sarah turned to face the crowd directly. "She's been stalking me for 3 years, documenting everything, looking for any excuse to drive me out of this neighborhood. And when she couldn't find legitimate violations, she decided to manufacture them." Bob Fletcher was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. "Sarah, we had no idea Margaret was bullshit." The profanity hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah Chen, the quiet engineer who'd endured 3 years of harassment with dignity, was done being polite. Janet Morrison was with Margaret when she delivered violation notices. "You, Bob, signed off on every single complaint. You want to tell me you never questioned why one resident was receiving 10 times more violations than anyone else in the community?" Janet stood up from her seat in the middle of the room, her face flushed. "We were just doing our jobs, maintaining community standards. Community standards that somehow only applied to me." Sarah's voice rose. "The Hendersons' fence is 2 inches higher than mine. The Patel's garden lights are twice as bright. The Morrisons' dog barks every morning at 6 a.m., but I'm the only one with a violation file thick enough to choke a horse." She clicked to another folder. "I've been documenting too, Janet. Every interaction, every snide comment, every suggestion, that maybe I'd be more comfortable in a different neighborhood. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the pattern?" The room erupted in angry voices. Neighbors turning on each other, accusations flying, 3 years of buried resentments finally surfacing. Sarah watched the chaos with grim satisfaction. Margaret's arrest had been the catalyst, but this explosion had been building for years. "ENOUGH, Bob shouted, banging a gavel frantically. Everyone calm down. But Sarah wasn't done. She pulled up one final video security footage from her front doorbell camera, showing Margaret's visit that very morning with Janet and Bob in tow. "This was recorded at 8:15 a.m., 5 hours after Margaret planted evidence in my backyard," Sarah announced. "Listen carefully." The audio was crystal clear. Margaret's voice filled the room. "Community standards evolve, Mrs. Chen. What was acceptable then may not be acceptable now. I'm sure you, being new to American homeownership customs, can appreciate the importance of maintaining our property values." The racist undertone was unmistakable now. played back for everyone to hear. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Yamadas, the only other Asian family in the development, looked stricken. New to American homeownership. Customs, Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. I was born in Sacramento. I have a PhD in environmental engineering. I've paid more in property taxes in the past 3 years than most of you make in salary. But to Margaret Whitmore, I'll always be the outsider who doesn't belong. Janet Morrison was crying now, her carefully constructed world of plausible deniability crumbling around her. Sarah, we never meant. Yes, you did. Sarah's voice was quiet again, but it carried to every corner of the room. You meant every violation notice, every snide comment, every attempt to make me feel unwelcome in my own home. You just never expected to face consequences for it. She turned to Bob Fletcher, who looked like he was about to vomit. Bob, as interim president, I'm sure you'll want to review the HOA's insurance policy, because Margaret Whitmore didn't act alone, and her victims aren't limited to me. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Sarah had done her research. 3 other families had moved out of Willowbrook Estates in the past 5 years, all citing irreconcilable differences with the HOA. All 3 families had been minorities. Mrs. Chen, Bob stammered, what exactly are you saying? Sarah smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm saying Margaret Whitmore's arrest is just the beginning. I'm saying the FBI's Civil Rights Division is very interested in patterns of housing discrimination, and I'm saying that by tomorrow morning. Every news outlet in the city is going to know exactly what kind of community standards Willowbrook Estates has been maintaining. She packed up her phone and headed for the door, leaving behind a room full of people whose comfortable little world had just collapsed around them. But as she reached the exit, Sarah turned back one final time. Oh, and Bob, the next HOA meeting is going to be very different, because I'm running for president, and I have a feeling the voters are going to be very interested in hearing about real community standards, the kind that don't depend on the color of your skin or where your parents were born. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the community center in stunned silence. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah's phone was already ringing with calls from reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. Margaret Whitmore's racist kingdom was crumbling, but Sarah Chen was just getting started. The call came at 6:17 a.m., 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting. Sarah was sipping her morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint her pool in shades of gold when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Is this Sarah Chen? The voice was young, nervous, clearly someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation. Speaking, my name is Marcus Williams. I used to live in Willowbrook Estates, Unit 47, on Oak Street. I also saw the news story about Margaret Whitmore's arrest. Sarah set down her coffee cup. The news had broken the previous evening, a piece by investigative reporter Lisa Chang detailing not just Margaret's arrest, but the systematic harassment campaign that preceded it. The story had gone viral overnight, shared thousands of times across social media with hashtags like #HOAKaren and #WillowbrookRacism. What can I do for you, Marcus? I need to tell you what happened to my family, what Margaret did to us. His voice cracked slightly. We moved out 2 years ago, and I thought it was over. But seeing that footage, hearing her voice, AGAIN, Mrs. Chen, we weren't the only ones. An hour later, Marcus Williams sat in Sarah's living room, his hands shaking as he scrolled through a folder on his phone. He was a software engineer in his early 30s, articulate and well-dressed, but Sarah could see the trauma lingering in his eyes. It started 6 months after we moved in. Marcus began violation notices for everything. Our mailbox was 2 inches too far to the left. Our grass was inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Our kids' toys were inappropriately stored if we left them on the porch for more than an hour. He showed Sarah photographs, dozens of them, documenting every violation notice, every interaction with the HOA board, every attempt his family had made to comply with increasingly absurd demands. But it wasn't just the violations, it was the other stuff. The way Margaret would show up at block parties and suddenly the conversation would die. The way our neighbors started avoiding us. The anonymous complaints about our kids being too loud when they played in our own backyard. Sarah's jaw tightened. The pattern was identical to her own experience, but Marcus's family had been targeted even more aggressively. The breaking point came when Margaret filed a complaint with Child Protective Services. Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She claimed we were neglecting our children because they played outside unsupervised. CPS had to investigate. They came to our house, interviewed our kids, examined our lives under a microscope. Jesus, Sarah breathed. The case was dismissed immediately. Our kids are happy, healthy, well cared for, but the damage was done. My 8-year-old daughter asked me why the lady with the clipboard hated us. How do you explain that to a child? Marcus pulled up another folder on his phone, legal documents, correspondence, a thick file of evidence that painted a picture of systematic harassment designed to drive his family away. We had a lawyer look into it. He said we had grounds for a discrimination lawsuit, but it would take years and cost more than our house was worth. So we sold at a loss. found a place across town, started over. I thought that was the end of it. Until yesterday. Until yesterday. Marcus met her eyes. Mrs. Chen, there are others. I have been in touch with the Gonzalez family who lived on Maple Street, and the Johnsons who were on Pine. Same pattern, same harassment, same ending. Margaret Whitmore has been systematically driving minorities out of Willowbrook Estates for years. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. By the time Marcus left an hour later, she'd received 17 messages from current and former residents, all wanting to share their stories, all painting the same picture of Margaret's reign of terror. That afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting across from FBI Special Agent Patricia Knox in a downtown coffee shop. Agent Knox was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair, the kind of person who'd seen too much but still cared about justice. Mrs. Chen, I'll be direct with you. What you've documented is potentially one of the clearest cases of housing discrimination we've seen in years, Knox said, reviewing the files Sarah had compiled. The problem is proving intent and establishing a pattern of systematic exclusion. I think I can help with that. Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a spreadsheet she'd been working on since the HOA meeting. I've analyzed every property transaction in Willowbrook Estates for the past 5 years. 43 homes have changed hands. Of those, 11 were sold by minority families, all at below market prices, all citing conflicts with the HOA. The reason for leaving? Knox's eyebrows rose. And the timing of these sales? 7 of them occurred within 6 months of Margaret Whitmore becoming HOA president. The other 4 happened in the year following major violations, campaign that, according to HOA records, targeted only minority homeowners. Sarah clicked to another tab. I've also been in contact with the families who left. 3 of them documented their experiences extensively. 2 had lawyers involved. One family, the Patels, actually filed a complaint with the State Civil Rights Commission before deciding to move instead of fighting. Agent Knox was taking notes rapidly. This is exactly what we need to build a federal case. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to testify before a grand jury? Agent Knox, I'll testify before Congress if it means stopping this. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Knox had enough evidence to launch a full federal investigation into housing discrimination in Willowbrook Estates. But as Sarah walked back to her car, she realized the real reckoning was still coming. Her phone rang as she reached the parking lot. The caller ID showed Janet Morrison's number. Sarah, please, we need to talk. Janet's voice was desperate, nearly hysterical. It's all falling apart. The insurance company is threatening to drop our coverage. 3 families are talking about lawsuits. The media won't stop calling. Margaret's lawyer is saying she'll cooperate with the FBI if they give her immunity. Sarah smiled grimly. Janet, you reap what you sow. Please, we can fix this. Bob's stepping down as interim president. We can hold new elections, change the bylaws, make things right. Just ... Just don't let this destroy our community. Your community was built on excluding people like me, Janet. Maybe it deserves to be destroyed. There was a long pause. When Janet spoke again, her voice was barely audible. What do you want from us? Sarah leaned against her car, looking up at the sky. For 3 years, she'd dreamed of this moment, the moment when the people who'd tormented her finally understood that actions have consequences. But now that it was here, she felt something unexpected, pity. I want Margaret Whitmore to face the full consequences of her actions. I want every family she drove away to get justice. And I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. And then, Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk. And then we'll see if this community is worth saving. She hung up and drove home through streets that looked different now, smaller somehow, less intimidating. The perfectly manicured lawns and pristine facades couldn't hide what lay beneath anymore. Everyone could see it now. That evening, as Sarah sat by her pool watching the sunset, her phone rang one more time. This time, the caller ID made her smile. Mrs. Chen, this is David Kim from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Willowbrook situation. I understand you're running for HOA president. That's right. And you have some ideas about reform. Sarah's smile widened. David, I have ideas about revolution. The old Willowbrook Estates was dying, but from its ashes, something better was about to be born. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. Election day for the new HOA board brought out 312 residents, nearly triple the typical turnout tanned. The energy in the room crackled with tension, anticipation, and the electricity of impending change. Sarah stood at the front of the room, no longer the quiet engineer who'd endured 3 years of harassment. She wore a sharp navy blazer and her grandmother's jade earrings, her black hair pulled back in a professional bun. Behind her, a presentation screen showed her campaign slogan, Real Community Standards for Everyone. The past month had been a whirlwind. Margaret Whitmore's federal arraignment had made national news. The FBI investigation had uncovered a paper trail of discrimination, so extensive that 3 other HOA communities in the county were now under federal scrutiny, and Sarah's story had become a rallying cry for homeowners' rights advocates across the country. But tonight was about Willowbrook. Before we begin voting, Sarah announced, her voice carrying easily to the back of the packed room, I want to introduce some people. Marcus Williams stood up from the third row, his wife beside him, their 2 children fidgeting in their seats. Behind them, the Gonzalez family. The Patels had driven in from their new home across town. The Johnsons had flown in from Portland, where they'd moved after Margaret's campaign drove them out. These are the neighbors Margaret Whitmore drove away, Sarah continued. They're here tonight because they believe Willowbrook can be better. They're here because they want their stories to mean something. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many residents were seeing these families for the first time in years, and the reality of what had happened was written on their faces. Bob Fletcher, who'd announced he wouldn't seek re-election after the security footage showed him actively participating in the harassment, sat hunched in the back corner. Janet Morrison had moved out of the community entirely the week before, selling her house to the first buyer who'd made an offer. The old guard was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum that tonight would either be filled with more of the same, or something entirely different. Sarah's opposition came in the form of Richard Hendricks, a retired insurance executive who'd moved to Willowbrook 6 months earlier. His campaign centered on returning to traditional values and healing the community's reputation. Coded language that everyone understood, Mrs. Chen Hendricks said during the candidate forum portion of the evening. While we all condemn what Mrs. Whitmore did, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This community has maintained excellent property values precisely because we've maintained standards. Are you proposing we abandon all oversight? Sarah's smile was sharp. Mr. Hendricks, I'm proposing we abandon selective enforcement. I'm proposing we abandon standards that mysteriously only apply to certain residents. And I'm proposing we abandon the idea that property values are more important than treating our neighbors with basic human dignity. She clicked to her first slide a detailed analysis of violation enforcement over the past 5 years. Under Margaret Whitmore's leadership, white homeowners received an average of 0.7 violations per year. Non-white homeowners received an average of 12.3 violations per year. Would you like to explain how traditional values account for that disparity? The room erupted in heated whispers. Several longtime residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hendricks tried to rally. Those statistics might be misleading. Perhaps some residents were simply less familiar with community expectations. The coded racism hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah had been waiting for this moment. Less familiar? Sarah's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Mr. Hendricks, I have a PhD in environmental engineering. Marcus Williams has a master's in computer science. Dr. Patel is a pediatric surgeon, but somehow we're all less familiar with how to maintain a lawn. She clicked to the next slide, photos of various homes in the community, with violation notices and dates overlaid. Here's the Henderson house with a fence that's 2 inches higher than regulation, no violations in 5 years. Here's the Morrison house with Christmas decorations left up until March, no violations. Here's my house with a fence that meets all city codes, landscaping from the approved plant list, and pool lighting installed by the previous homeowner, 47 violations in 3 years. The visual evidence was devastating. Even Hendricks's most ardent supporters couldn't argue with the clear pattern of discrimination. Dr. Patel stood up from his seat. I would like to say something. The room fell silent. The Patels had been well liked before Margaret's campaign drove them out, and many residents felt guilty about what had happened. My family lived here for 4 years, Dr. Patel said, his accented English, precise and clear. We loved this community. We paid our taxes, maintained our property, contributed to the school fundraisers. But Margaret Whitmore made it clear we would never truly belong. The violations, the complaints, the constant surveillance, it wasn't about property standards. It was about making us understand that we were unwelcome. His voice broke slightly. My daughter asked me why the neighbors didn't like us anymore. She was 7 years old. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that some people hate you for the color of your skin? The room was dead silent now. Several women were crying openly. Sarah Chen is running for HOA president, not for revenge, but for healing. Dr. Patel continued. She's running to make sure no other family has to explain to their children why hatred is disguised as community standards. When the votes were tallied an hour later, Sarah had won by a landslide, 247 votes to Hendricks's 65. But the real victory came in the board elections, where every single candidate who'd endorsed Sarah's reform platform won their races. As the results were announced, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The celebration afterward was unlike anything Willowbrook had ever seen. Families who'd been driven out mingled with neighbors who'd stayed. Children who'd been taught to fear each other played together on the community center playground. Old divisions began to heal in real time, but Sarah knew the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, she stood before her first official board meeting. As president, a stack of new bylaws in front of her. The community center was packed again. Word had spread about the Willowbrook revolution, and housing advocates from across the region had come to witness what many were calling a model for HOA reform. Our first order of business, Sarah announced, is to formally apologize to every family that was driven from this community by discriminatory enforcement. We will be establishing a victim compensation fund, financed by the insurance settlement from Margaret Whitmore's criminal actions. The board voted unanimously in favor. Second, we're implementing the Fairness Protocol, a system of transparent, objective enforcement that applies equally to all residents. Violation notices must be accompanied by photographic evidence, citations of specific bylaw violations, and documentation that identical situations haven't been ignored elsewhere in the community. Another unanimous vote. Third, we're establishing the Community Inclusion Committee, tasked with actively welcoming new residents and ensuring our community reflects the diversity that makes our city strong. As the meeting progressed, Sarah felt the weight of 3 years of harassment lifting from her shoulders. Margaret Whitmore's reign of terror was over. The old system that had protected racism behind a facade of property values was being dismantled, piece by piece. But the sweetest moment came at the end of the meeting, when Marcus Williams stood up to address the room. 6 months ago, my family would never have considered moving back to Willowbrook, he said. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that we've put an offer on the house at 23 Oak Street. We're coming home. The applause was thunderous. Sarah watched as neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid the Williams family now stood to welcome them back. It wasn't perfect, healing never is, but it was a beginning. As the meeting adjourned and people filtered out into the warm evening air, Sarah remained behind, cleaning up papers and reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared woman who'd opened her door to Margaret Whitmore's harassment 3 years ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the only way to find justice is to build it yourself. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Knox. Federal charges against Whitmore. Finalized. 23 counts, including civil rights violations. She's looking at serious prison time. Thought you should know. Sarah smiled and typed back. Justice served. Now comes the hard part, making sure it never happens again. Outside, Willowbrook Estates looked the same as always, perfect lawns, pristine facades, the picture of suburban tranquility, but something fundamental had changed. The community standards were still there, but now they included standards that actually mattered. Fairness, inclusion, and the radical idea that all neighbors deserve to be treated with dignity. Margaret Whitmore's kingdom of fear was dead. In its place, Sarah Chen had built something Batora community, where property values and human values could coexist, where differences were celebrated rather than persecuted, and where the American dream was big enough for everyone. The revolution was complete, but the real victory was just beginning.